One of the topics that I'm most hesitant to speak about with students that they often raise, in fact, a student from South Asia just raised it with me yesterday, is colorism. And so I thought I'd take some time to talk about it, both in terms of the context of the classrooms in which I teach now, and using a few examples that the students often want to hear from me. So I lived in New Delhi from 2003 till 2011. I was both working there in public health for international development agencies and working as a writer. I'm going to mention that. And also as an activist. I had the blessing of being there during the period when there was a crescendo of activism around queer rights or LGBT rights. In fact, a colonial law from 1860 had been eradicated. It came back and there was some other mess that happened around it, but formally, the fight had really been won at this point. And the activism that I saw about this and about this topic and the solidarity, despite the things that I'm about to say, is what I most take away from my time in India. So, colorism. For those of you who aren't familiar with colorism, it is a color code. The idea that there is a hierarchy of skin colors. Many people may think of this in terms of racism, but as more contemporary writers like Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote The Worth of Other Suns, has explained in her subsequent work, Caste, racism is only a part of understanding caste. And caste is really more of what we're speaking about in the West. And so that's why Bell Hooks, of course, built her entire theoretical work around helping us articulate that what we now call intersectionality, what she initially called the necessity to look at gender, race, class, and what she later added sexuality to her work, and to this infamous term, white supremacist, capitalist, racist, heteronormative society, thinking, norms. And so the first thing that you must know, dear listener, is that I'm quite clear that the reason why many students come up to me after class or in a private moment and say, hey, you mentioned that you spent time in India. They use many different ways to ask this. And one thing I appreciate is that when they just ask me. Now, of course, as you know, as a person of color who grew up in a society that has a color caste, I'm sensitive to it as well. And as a sociologist and someone interested in, therefore, transforming society for the better, it's not a stretch to imagine that I would be ready to speak about it because I want to resist it, because I know, as the color cast is, it's a tyranny of oppression. It's a form of tyranny of beauty that Naomi Wolf talks about. But this added layer of race means that when I was in the Peace Corps in Mali, I had to sometimes close my eyes from the glare of orange skin around me. We called them Fanta Coca-Cola, because some people couldn't afford to bleach their whole bodies. And even more so, their knuckle skin and creases regenerated so much more quickly to their natural form, so that even when they bleached and this unnatural, ugly orange color emerged underneath, they would have, they look like Fanta. Their knuckles and the creases of their skin would still look like Coca-Cola. And so in West Africa, there were ways to, even in popular culture, to think more critically about it and resist it, such that, yellow fever from Fela Kuti. And so in India, and even today, when I have South Asian students approach me and want to talk about it, I do understand that they're talking about, my mama told me I was too dark, or my mama told me that I was lighter than somebody else in my family, and that was supposed to make me feel good, but it made me feel bad because they're putting my siblings down. When I worked at Time Out magazine, by the time I got this assignment to write the gay and lesbian page for a nationally syndicated magazine and be the first person to actually put their name on there, it says it's written by me, right? To actually physically say D'Eprier Cuckoo wrote this and not an anonymous person, because the extent of homophobia, people felt fearful and silenced, reasonably so. So as an outsider, I had one of these privileges. Come back to that. Privilege of access. So here I was writing for this nationally syndicated magazine. And by that time, as I said, I already knew what Bollywood looked like. On the adjacent page was literally the Prince of Bollywood, Mr. Bachchan, who he himself and his wife, especially his wife, are literally fetishized for, like, she's fetishized for her light hazel eyes and light skin. And she, while Aishwarya Rai herself says that she doesn't endorse skin bleach products like most of the people in her industry do, there are people who I've heard in the industry who would call upon such people to advocate more on behalf of eradicating the idea of a color cast, because when I say color cast for Bollywood and Hollywood, it's literal. It's literal. Like there's a cast of people and there's a color, and people darker than the brown paper bag just don't get in past being the chorus, because they're not dark enough to be the bad guy. So you got to be darker to be the bad guy, and so they're never the good people. And so here I am on my syndicated page every week, every fortnight, having to work with an artist to give a visual representation of the ideas or topics I'm writing about. Now, if I'm writing about a movie event, for example, pretty straightforward. I can write about, I can show a film clip. Or if I'm doing, as I did on my very first assignment, I'm looking at the picture now, I got to interview the openly gay member of the Nepalese parliament, Mr. Sunil Pant. Like that was my first assignment for this magazine. Is hey, go interview go interview a member of parliament in the neighboring country, and ask them how they were able to get their country to recognize a third gender, one of the first in the world. But on a normal day, you have this. And I know this is going to sound shady, and I'm really not trying to throw our artists under the bus, because this is great. But what you'll notice here is that, like in most of all of the editions I did, I wrote for them for over a year, the sketches are of very fair-skinned people. And this went on for a while, and I started to say, well, hey, can I engage directly? I literally went through the editor. May I engage with the illustrator? Can we have a meeting? Can we just throw around some ideas? How do you perceive the words that I'm writing, that I submit, that are given to them through the editor? So I went to that person directly, went to the office for the first time. That was literally the one of the few times that I had to physically go into the office, because if you want to talk about working remotely, well, writers work remotely even then. And so this is from 2009 edition. Same time I was also doing modeling in Vogue and Elle Decor. And I remember saying to the illustrator for this, how about we come to the window of the office and we look outside? How about we stand up from the cubicles and we just look around at the people in this room who make this magazine work? Can we draw people who look like all of them, and not only people who are fair-skinned? I literally mustered every bit of mindfulness I could muster to find ways to communicate with the people in the office, the editor-in-chief of the Delhi edition, the illustrators, the people looking at other sections. I was like, hey, how do you guys deal with this? Or, hey, you guys have, I wasn't trying to be shady or going around anybody's back. But one of the things that's evident here is that I had access because I'm a first language, like English is my first language. I'm educated. I was in the activist circles to meet the people who were involved in this, which meant that I had some access to gay and lesbian events to even speak about here. All those things, some of them depended on me being out and willing to be out. And so having the privilege to be out depended on even my nationality, my class, my education, my religion. I didn't grow up in a religion that stigmatized me where I had to unlearn self hate about being queer. And I also grew up in an environment that didn't teach me the color cast. In fact, we explicitly were against it. And so professionally, I knew that I was compromising myself by allowing what I eventually termed fair skin madness to dictate, to even accompany or represent my name. This was my name. Like, here was my name. And I was the first openly gay person in the country to do this at the time, to say, here's a gay person who's writing about gay stuff in a national magazine in India. To have it whitewashed, subjected to the color cast, was also personally insulting. And so I knew I had to temper that. I knew I had to temper that and not just be like, angry black man. But here's the thing. Here's why the color cast also matters on an interpersonal basis. When I show up as a dark-skinned black person and I say to people, so what about the color cast? I don't really have to say much else. And that's why I wish we would all just use the game and get involved in challenging the color cast. Because when it comes to my students, I am very protective of my students. I need to let them know that this stuff is out there, that someone will ask you to compromise who you are if they even let you get in the door, right? Because as I said, in most of the elite spaces in which I was able to gain access there in India, especially socially, I was often the darkest person in the room. That included the Habitat Center, India International Center, the Jim Corbett. I mean, any of these elite club places, I was the darkest person not in uniform on a basic Saturday or Sunday. In some of the elite academic spaces, I was the darkest person not sweeping or serving drinks. And I understand in the ways that people that I got to know there and also here have raised these issues with me. Of course, I say to myself, well, wait a minute. For example, my husband is also a 7.5-year veteran of living in Delhi and also did similar things and worked and gained access because of who he is, his gender, his race, his religion. He's a normal looking, Western white middle class man. And he presents himself as that. He's even kind of, as they say, more straight acting. So I saw the kinds of access that they gained him. And so for him to understand that, he had to see it to believe it. So he had to literally see that some of these rooms that I'm talking about, it's like, oh yeah, everyone else in here is dark, working. Or, oh, I can see how in the general public people respond differently, and how he saw people stop and stare. I even had a YouTube channel all about that. People would just stop and stare. While people would be curious and come to him and, hi, sir, people would stare, be frozen, or even move away from me. And so he, as a Western white person, had to learn that, and he got to see that firsthand in India. And what's powerful, and this is where solidarity again shows up its head, is that he now speaks openly about it as an educator, as a mentor, as a leader. He's the one to open the conversation about inequality and creating equity, and doesn't just leave it to those of us who are in those marginalized identity groups, doesn't just leave it to the women to talk about male privilege, doesn't leave it to white people, people of color, to talk about straight up racism or microaggressions. And so solidarity matters. People hear things differently from me when I say them, as I said, which is also why I believe people have been prompted to, just like the student yesterday, to ask me about colorism and my experiences of colorism, because not only did they think I must know something, because I never mentioned anything about it, they just raise it. but they also perhaps know that I would be empathetic towards understanding them, and then that in that understanding, that in itself helps alleviate the suffering that colorism has brought upon us in our world. Stop it. Stop it.